Hello, I'm Brian Mulligan, and I'm here to show you how this Autodesk graphics template that you've downloaded was built and put together so that you can customize it for your own needs. Let's take a look at this one. Now, this dancing panels effect was created using 20 separate geometric objects that are cascading and rotating through an expression. And then there's an image that's being mapped onto each of the two sides. Now, the trick to this FBX model that's imported and built was that it had to be created in exactly a 1920 by 1080 aspect ratio so that it would fit and map the HD video perfectly. There's also room at the end for a title. This entire effect happens within one single Connect Effects effect. Let's take a look at it. The effect is basically a Connect Effects built upon a gap, so it's just an adjustment segment. This top layer here is basically just for the demo recording, and it's a hard commit layer. Let's take a look inside of our Connect Effects and see how this is put together. So you can see that this is a fairly simple Connect Effects setup. It basically consists of several media inputs that feed into a Matchbox node that then feed into a media layer that go into action. There are two sets of these Matchbox nodes, one here and one here, with different video sources feeding into them. These are basically side A and side B of the 3D geometry that we saw in the demo. The Matchbox effect is set up to be a switcher so that it switches the input of each of these video sources depending on when it's being shown inside the action effect. If we look down here at this one, you can see that there's a video source going into a color correct node to pretty it up, and then a text node to add some text on the side. Let's go to a 2-up view, and you can see what that does. Once again, our base video, our color correct node to stylize it, and then a text effect node to add some title. You can go ahead and change the text at any time via the text node, or you can add an action node here and use some 3D text if that's what you're liking. You'll notice there's a few notes in the schematic that tell you, here's a Connect Effects node that is optional and specific to this Indy skyline clip. The text node can be replaced by action using the 3D text. You'll find several of these notes available that will help and guide you through your schematic. This one says you can drag and drop your clips replacing these images. So if you like this effect simply as is and just want to replace the images, simply go to your media library, open up a clip that you want, and simply drag and drop it onto one of the other video clips and release, and it will update. So let's take a look at our action schematic where all the magic is actually happening. This action schematic is fairly large and complex with this 3D model. So let's hide our media library and resize our windows so we can get a better look. If we zoom into the top here, you can see that we have our main panel axis, which feed down and control each element of our 3D geometry. So if we take a look at this effect somewhere in the middle, you can see that each of these axis group nodes here controls each of these individual panels, and there are 20 of them in this model. So if I select this axis here, it's the front part of this model. The middle one would be the sides and the top, and the other axis being the far back part of it. So this axis control right here controls this entire block. So as you click along, you can see where each of these panels is in the scene. So now that we have the top, sides, and back of each of these panels, we need to map our video as a texture to them. You can see that these first elements are all connected to material nodes, which are grouped down here using another material node, an axis node, and then finally our diffused map. If we navigate down through here even more, you can see that the second group has a diffuse node set up to be the sides of our image. Using this brush metal. The brush metal is color corrected inside of Action. And then finally, if we zoom out and go all the way down here at the bottom, the back of all these models is set up here. So you'll find in your media list that we have media input 1 is the front of our model, media input 2 would be the back, media input 3 is the sides and the top. If we jump back out to our Connect Effects schematic, look at our inputs. Media 1 is being fed by this Matchbox node. And this Matchbox node has these 4 inputs. Media 2, the back side of our models, is being fed by these 4 inputs. If we click on the Matchbox node, like I said, it's really just being used as a switcher. There are keyframes in place that match when each side should be seen. So as the image rotates and flips around, the Matchbox nodes switch from one input to the next, depending on the timing of our effect. Down here, this brushed aluminum texture is what we're using for our top and sides. Down here, this group of nodes is actually being used to generate our floor. If we double click the note, it says this section creates the floor pattern. Feel free and create your own. Let's take a look at how this is built. We basically, once again, start out with a simple colored frame. I feed that into a Gmask node, where I've cut it up into 2 triangles. I then take that into a 2D transform, just to shrink it down just a little bit. That's now being fed into an Edge Detect node, where I can just pull the edges of those triangles. I'm then going to combine that into this Blend and Comp node with this another colored frame being set up as a gradient, just to sort of create a little subtle gradient within this panel. So when they're all combined, by simply taking the lines and feeding them in as a front and a matte, and basically using a screen mode, blending them over the background, I have basically one tile of our floor. This tile floor is being fed now into media 4 of our action input. If we go back into our action schematic, you can see that here's our tile floor. If we zoom in and pan over, you can see that our tile floor is a diffuse map on this geometry. This simple geometry is just a flat plane, one of the base models included inside of Smoke, and we're mapping it with our diffuse texture. Now this diffuse texture is set up to be in a mirror repeat mode. I've then used the axis controller for it to adjust the scale. Now you can see that this is set to be really small, 0.20. So by adjusting the increments of this ever so slightly, by 0.1, and hitting Add, I can change the size of the tiles on the floor, generating any type of look that I want. So you can create your own pattern back out on Connect Effects through these nodes by adjusting your own garbage mask in Edge Detect and floor coloring to generate your own tile, which will then get repeated as a tile pattern in our Action 3D scene. Back into Action again. Now this setup of axis nodes creates a very special camera rig for this scene. You'll notice that right now we do not have any reflections on the floor for our 3D models. What this rig does is take one main action camera and mirrors it and creates a second one at an inverted axis. So if we look at our other camera, the mirror camera, we get a flipped version of our scene. If I hide the floor, you can see that down here, below the floor, we have an inverted model. So there are actually two cameras in this scene. One being our main camera, showing our main view, and the other one, a completely mathematically inverted camera that we're going to use to comp our floor reflection outside of this action. But all you have to worry about is the main camera animation, should you want to change this. Let's bring our floor back. If I click on this camera at any point, you're free to adjust the orbit or rotation of your camera. And manipulate your scene in 3D as you see fit. All through this one camera node here. You'll also notice in this scene there are several lens flares being generated, which control the lighting in our scene as our camera moves around. You can turn them on and off by turning on and off the lights. There's also another light, creating an ambient light in the scene with a shadow cast node, which allows shadows to fall from each of the individual 3D objects onto one another to help create a more realistic look. If you go to the output node, you can see that we're also using ambient occlusion. If we zoom in and turn the ambient occlusion off, you can see that there's just some very subtle shading being generated, which adds to the realism of the scene. If you'd like to render this scene a little faster, just to see what's going on, turn ambient occlusion off by selecting it and turning off the LED for it. You can also take your shadow cast node and turn off shadows by selecting no shadows. Back at our action outputs, you can see that there are 4 outputs being generated from this action. If we look at them, you have your main comp output, which is everything in the scene. We have another output, which is just that inverted camera geometry. We also have a matte for that geometry being generated, and we have a matte for the main scene being generated. These 4 outputs are used in Connect Effects, being fed into this final action scene. Here you can see the reflection being generated on the floor with our geometry. Inside this action, there are just 2 layers. One our main scene, one the reflection. The background of our main comp is also being fed into this action scene. By clicking on the reflection image, you can see that you can adjust the transparency using a blend mode to create as much reflection as you want. Also, in this media layer, we've blurred this scene just a bit to create a blurry reflection that you can dial in to taste. So what's being done here is that the reflection is simply being composited in using these mattes that are provided from the other action scene. This allows us to have a little bit more control in compositing our final look. If we go back to our main action scene, where the animations are all happening, the timing of everything is actually being controlled by this spin control axis in this P1 panel, which is the first panel in our scene. If we look at the animation menu for our P1 axis, we open it up, look at the rotation and frame, you can see that the white keyframes here are what control the rotation of our geometry. This main P1 axis control controls all of the other geometry slices in this model. So by adjusting one, you adjust the rest. They are all controlled through this axis node with an expression. If you look at the properties of this axis node, in the X rotation value, you'll see a value of 3. So basically it means that each of the rotations are offset by 3 frames. Once again, looking at our animation channels, if I adjust the value of our first model, everything else will adjust. These black lines are the cascaded animations being run by the expression. If you look at one of the other models, P10, you can see that in the X rotation field, that you'll see this little E. By looking at the expression down here, it basically is evaluating the value in P1 rotation X, and then comparing it to the frame of the animation, and minusing the value in the X position of the spin axis, which we saw was 3. It then basically has this multiplier of 9, which basically is the position of the geometry within this group. P1 being our first one, and then P2 being our second one, but with an offset of 1. P2 then being the second one in the group, so it's got a multiplier of 1. It basically boils down to whatever this position is, this multiplier is 1 less, because you don't count the original P1 animation. So if you'd like to change the speed of this animation, you change 2 things. 1, P1 axis, where the rotation to the backside is controlled, and then rotating back to the front. Once you have the timing of your first panel done, the other ones will follow, based on the offset of the spin axis here in the rotation value. So if I change this to 5, these panels are now offset 5 frames from one another. I can then also change it down to 1, where they're very tightly rotated and offset only 1 frame. You could crank it all the way up to, say, 8, and really create a staggered animation effect. So the one thing to think about in all of this is as you change this timing, you may also need to go back into Connect Effects and adjust the timing of your Matchbox nodes and the keyframes within it. If you look at those animation keyframes in our Matchbox node, you can see that these are simple hold keyframes that switch the images as it hits those keyframes. So by just looking at the value of the place and time in your animation, you can grab these and move them so that they line up where you need to based on your geometry animation. So it's a little give and take and a little back and forth. One last thing about this animation, go back into our action schematic, is that this animation is set up to have several rotations and several images. If you don't need that many, we can click on our P1 controlling axis, look at our animation, and if I only needed 3 or 4 rotations, I can highlight these other animations and delete them by simply going into our Tools menu, hitting Delete, highlighting them, and deleting them. Now, this animation only has 4 rotations and therefore only 4 different images. You might then just need to adjust your camera animation to bring this back full screen. I'm going to undo this to get back to what we had. So there is a lot going on in this action setup, but once you break it down into its individual parts, it's not so hard to understand. Those parts being camera animation, the floor, the lens flares, the main geometry, the diffuse maps for those geometries, the object controlling animation, and the offset animation for the cascade. And once again, back on Connect Effects, it's easy to change your images by simply going to your media library, finding your video clip that you want, dragging and dropping it, and releasing it. There are a few other elements to this template that you might be interested in. One, there's a panels transition, which will basically go from one full screen piece of video, flip back into these panels to another full piece of video, making a nice transition. You also have a lower third, which has your floor and some animated 3D titling that flip in and rotate just like your panels do. So thanks for checking out this Autodesk Connect Effects graphics template.